Below is part of my speech that I was going to share. I watch my parents getting older, and all I can think is what is going to happen next. There's not a day where I don't think of losing everything my family has created. There's no day where I do not tend to imagine the worst. There are nights that haunt me because I fear something could happen next. My parents shaped the woman I am today, but lately I have been feeling hopeless. Our journey is lonely and fragile. I now have to focus on surviving and protecting my loved ones. I have one last semester in college, and all I can think is if I can make it. I don't think my feelings can ever be expressed over a speech. The tears that come down my cheeks remind me of how weak I have become over the past 2 years. Undocumented families are suffering. I'm suffering, and now I have to once again go into the shadows. The separation of families does not only happen at the border, but as well here. Families all over the Tri-Cities are being separated. According to the National Immigrant Justice Center, Virginia is home to 37 detention centers. You have the power to change and protect the undocumented community. The immigrant community in Virginia needs 1, rapid response teams that are able to stop deportations. 2, fund groups doing bail solidarity. 3, trusted immigration lawyers that are willing to fight and not choose profit over us. 4, know your rights trainings are not enough anymore because not everyone in the undocumented community is going to drive and risk themselves from being stopped by local police that could lead to their deportation. We have to knock doors just like we knock doors. Everyone standing here needs to use their privilege as citizens to protect undocumented.
Good afternoon. This is Jay Tubb with Citizen Voices Radio. Hate to interrupt that, but it will be back on our loop tonight. We have a 6-hour loop. And you're listening to WRWK. Pick it up.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Citizen Voices. A lot has happened this week, and we're really excited about the guests that we have on the show today. Calling in actually now is Neil LaFerrier from Summers County, West Virginia. Neil took a trip to Washington, D.C. to speak with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission this week. And we're also going to be welcoming Richard Averett, who made the same trip to D.C. to testify in front of 2 FERC commissioners. We are also glad to have Jonathan Sokolow and Tammy Belinsky on the show to speak some to, many different aspects, but some of the legal issues surrounding the pipelines, the Mountain Valley and Atlantic Coast pipelines, as well as Jamie Hale from Giles County, Virginia, who's going to give us a comprehensive, up-to-date report from yesterday on the ground in Southwest Virginia, where we had a tree sitter who actually locked down in the line as the construction approaches the Yellowfinch blockade, which has been in existence for 323 days today. So lots to talk about, and I believe we have Neil already on the line with us. Neil, are you here?
Neil, can you hear us?
Neil,
you there?
There you are. Welcome. Good to hear your voice, my friend. So welcome home to Summers County from the capital of the nation. It was quite a trip, it sounds like, to D.C. to speak with the FERC.
It was a good trip, and well worth the effort that we made to get up there. And I think one of the key elements that surprised not only us, but perhaps the commissioners as well, was the ability to humanize the issues that we're facing and put a face and tell our stories about how we're being treated and bullied around a little bit, for the commissioners to show the human side, and as well, I think one of the biggest things that I took away is that they know this system is broken, and they understand that these rules and regulations were put in place for a system 50 years ago where, you know, the pipes didn't go all over the place and jig-jags and back and forth. They were straight lines from one place to another, and there's one maybe every 10 years, not 10 every year or however many we're looking at now.
Yeah, it's definitely changed a lot. And there have been some indications that some of the FERC commissioners are actually paying attention. I can't say as I have a whole lot of faith in the humanization in terms of the effect it's going to have on their decisions, but I am so willing to be wrong, Neil, if that's the case. I think that there were some details uncovered by you and Richard, and who else was present at this meeting? There were other folks there as well.
The Howlands were there from the Penn East Pipeline, and I'm not going to remember his names, but the mayor from the New Jersey Township as well, who was affected by the pipeline going directly through her community. Richard probably knows her. He's met her a couple of times now. But the stories that were told, they really hit home, not just for me, but as well with the commissioners. And I think we need to continue to keep that pressure up and continue to put that on the table, because at the end of the day, it's what's at stake. And I think, you know, we got an opportunity to take that what's at stake message and put it, you know, right in front of their faces, where they couldn't just sit up in their 8th floor or 7th floor office building and you know, not see the issues at hand anymore.
Yes, I agree. And I think that the power of our stories in this context is really important, whether it's, you know, the commissioners or each other. I know that I was familiar with the Holleran story for some time, given that they lost, I believe, 90% of their family's sugar maple farm to the Constitution pipeline, which was never built. The trees were cut, and then New York denied the water permitting, as I understand it, and there's no way they've never even been compensated. So, you know, that injustice was really obvious, as is yours.
Not only did they lose their trees, but it was used as a quick take, and then they waited after the quick take, you know, the quick take saying, hey, we have to get this done before the migratory bird season is up, and we have to get this done right away. So they utilized quick take, and then after getting the quick take, they waited an entire year. They came in during maple or sugar season and made the Howlands remove all of their taps, costing them business. They came in with a security force and police officers carrying semi-automatic weapons. I mean, they came out full force, bully style, and forced their way through cutting over 500 tappable trees, over 5 acres. And it's just a 21-acre parcel, and mature maple trees. It's not like those. It's not like those can be planted back, and you know, all of a sudden in 10 years you've got your production back up.
Exactly.
Those trees are 50, 60, 100 years old, and they, you know, the Howlands have been sitting now. That was back in 2015, and it's 4 years later, and they still have not been paid for their property or damages, and they haven't even been able to get on the docket.
It's ridiculous. I mean, and this is fair warning. You know, I've part of the reason I paid attention to this story is because it was so striking, and to know that now this, you know, it's taken this long for them to even get heard, much less any action taken, and will it even be able to be taken? So I'm very glad that you were there with them, and I believe we have Richard Averett joining us here. Richard,
how are you today?
I'm doing great. Sorry, I was on mute for a moment there, so I didn't disturb you all.
Yeah. So we've got Neil on with Mara and myself, And I'd love to hear, first of all, give us some background of your involvement with the pipelines and how you got to speak to the FERC commissioners, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Yeah, sure. So our family, I'm a Nelson County landowner. We live in the Rockfish Valley in Nelson County, and we bought property here together in 2003, along with my sister, my wife's sister, and my parents, with the express intent of raising our kids next to each other and sort of creating a long-term family homestead. We moved here in 2005 when we had enough facilities to live in, and built houses, and have raised our children here ever since. And then in the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was first proposed to come through Nelson County. It was north of us a bit and would have run through an area called Shannon Farms with some good friends of ours. And that's actually when we first heard about the pipeline. And I can remember coming home and explaining it to my extended family and letting them know we needed to do something. We needed to lean in and write letters and things because, you know, while it wasn't our property, it was our community. And it was certainly something that, you know, that could just as easily have happened to us. But lo and behold, they proposed something about 6 months later called the South Alternative Route, which now goes directly through our family homestead and an investment property that my father and I bought together here to help sort of develop, ironically, sort of around ecotourism here, celebrating all of the things we love in the Rockfish Valley and in Nelson County about its natural, undisturbed environment. So that's what brings us to it, and what brings me to the FERC meetings is really the great efforts by the Niskanen Center to push forward what we think is at least a very universal concern around these pipelines, which is the issue of citizens' rights and property rights. And they really, it started out, I would say, as property rights in its traditional sense, you know, our sort of constitutional rights to our own land that we may have purchased or inherited. And over time, what we understand is it's not just property rights or land rights, but it's also citizens' rights and due process rights. The entire FERC system is designed in such a way that people like Neil and I and the Hallorans truly have no opportunity for a right to due process or to protect our land, our families, our communities. And so the Niskanen Center invited me to join so that we had representatives from 4 different pipelines.
Yes, that's a wonderful effort. We can only hope that some progress gets made here, because they are definitely not respecting your rights or the communal right to water. That's one of the main concerns for everybody else, is that we're all downstream, especially in Richmond from Nelson County. So that was a good opportunity. It doesn't sound like the FERC commissioners really agreed to take any action to help either you or Neil for the ACP or the MVP.
Well, I'll say yes and no. I mean, I think that there was an agreement that they were going to look into a letter, I believe, that was written by the Office of Energy Policy that from at least one of the commissioners' perspectives should prohibit construction beginning again this fall. And they're going to give us some details on that. They seem genuinely concerned about some of the the sort of gross abuses of citizens' rights that we're talking about, and the way in which the FERC process is playing out in the field. But you're right; they did not. They didn't agree. They didn't walk away from there saying, "That's it. We've had enough. We're going to put a stop to it." Which, of course, is something all of us would love, but none of us expected.
Right. So, what is the relationship between the FERC and the Office of Energy Policy?
That's a great question, and I'm unclear on that. It is my belief that the only thing that will stop either the MVP or the ACP from continuing to do damage to our communities at this time when both pipelines are in great jeopardy over at least the Appalachian Trail crossing, if not other, water permit and endangered species issues. I think the only thing that can stop that really is a court order or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC, telling them to cease and desist all construction. And I'll tell you, one of the real vagaries of this that's very confusing for landowners and for the citizens and worth explaining is that there are activities that are considered pre-construction, which literally don't fall under sort of permits for construction and the ability to build the pipeline. And they include cutting all the trees, taking them out, clearing the vegetation, grading the land, and in some cases, I believe even the trenching part, like sort of digging the hole in which the pipe would lay. And most of that is considered pre-construction. And so when we get these orders that say no construction activity will commence, if it doesn't also explicitly describe the pre-construction activities, we can expect that the ACP or MVP will continue to do the lion's share of the sort of environmental and local damage to the land, while they effectively aren't allowed to build the pipeline, which is typically more or less putting the pipe in the ground and welding it together and covering it back up.
Yeah, that's really should not. That seems pretty arbitrary distinction.
So I know that we've had some question. Go ahead, Neil.
What you're saying correctly, even though ACP has a stop work order, when tree cutting can commence again, in late August, they could potentially come in and cut the trees across your property, even though there is an active stop work order on the ACP?
So, Neil, two things. I want you and everyone else to know I'm unclear as to whether or not there is a true stop work order. We've asked for that letter because in the community that's been working so hard on this, there's no real evidence that I've seen that there's a stop work order. The ACP has quote unquote voluntarily stopped work and construction, mostly because they're not in tree felling season, which begins in mid-September again. But you're right. I have every reason to believe that in mid-September, even with a you can't construct, work order, if such a thing exists, that they will come and cut trees if they can, because that will qualify as this pre-construction kind of activity. In our case, they're going to have to file for immediate possession or quick take, like they did on the Hallorans, in order to get the land. So they can't come straight away because they don't have easements, across the property. But they're going to try, and they're going to try soon.
Wow. Yeah, that's just, I understand what you mean about due process. I mean, it sounds like you're between a rock and a hard place because they're not listening to you. They're doing what they want with your property, in both you and Neil's case. And then you have to, if you want to do something, you have to get a lawyer, put an action in, and then wait for it to go to court or something. But that's really...
That's right, Jay. In our case, we have a court case or court date for our eminent domain hearing because we have fought them at every turn. And that date is January of 2021. And that's when the court set the date. So this idea of quick take or immediate possession, I don't know if you all have talked about that, but it comes from the Sage versus East Tennessee ruling about 14 years ago. And it's literally an extension or an aberration to the eminent domain laws. It doesn't really exist in law. It's sort of usurping Congress's power to define the laws because the law is clear. It says that you can only take someone's land after fair and just compensation has been made. And if you can't agree on what fair and just compensation is, then you go to court, and the court helps make a determination, and then you can take the land in theory. What's happening in these cases is the pipelines are saying, hey, look, like ours, we can't wait till January of 2021 to get through the Averets property. So let's just have the court agree that we get to take the land. We're only arguing over the price. And so just give us the land now, and we'll sort out the value thing later when we get to go to court. That's very much what happened to the Hallorans. And in their case, as you can see, the pipeline got killed, and they can't even get on the docket to go have that argument about how much compensation they're owed for the damage done for a pipeline that was never built. And what we've been saying is, if the courts think it's so important to accelerate the decision making for the pipeline or for any of these projects, then the right remedy is accelerate the court date. I mean, we're ready to go now. Put the court date in October. Let's go have this out. But the idea that the right remedy is to just take your land before you get to have your day in court, to argue over whether or not they get to take it, to argue about whether or not the process has been done appropriately and thoroughly, to argue about the price if you end up there. All of those things is outrageous. I mean, it literally means that we have we're sort of, we have, if the old thing about innocent until proven guilty, if this was that kind of a case, the case is decided before we ever get a day in court. And and at that point, all the damage is done, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so, how do you argue over the value of a piece of property that isn't for sale? You don't want them here for any price, under any circumstance.
Well, and this right there is why Tammy Belinsky and I tend to refer to them as lawless criminals, because it really doesn't seem as if there is any legal precedent for any of this other than they get what they want when they want it. And I think Neil is an excellent example of that, considering everything. I mean, excellent and heartbreaking all at the same time, because Neil, you're in the middle of this right now. What the story you told about the Hallorans and what happened with them, can you explain to our listeners just a little bit about what has happened since, say, last September, and what brought you to the table at this meeting?
Yes, a good portion of the reason that I am involved is in relation to what I would consider criminal negligence by Mountain Valley Pipeline and or their subcontractors in relation to on property. In September of last year, Mountain Valley Pipeline subcontractor flew over our property, dropping from a helicopter pellets intended for erosion control on the actual right-of-way, but they were not flying on the right-of-way, and not only did they not go over the right-of-way, they actually hit me and my family, causing bruises and contusions on two of my girls' faces. We went through a process of calling all the agencies that we knew to call and not getting any help. We called the pipeline company immediately within 10 minutes of the pellets being dropped. And at that point in time, the expectation was that my point of contact with the pipeline would call the helicopter company and say, hey, don't do this. And unfortunately, that did not happen. The helicopter continued to fly over my property, making over a dozen passes, continuing to drop pellets on my organic farm, my certified organic farm. And then when we finally were able to meet with the Mountain Valley Pipeline and a FERC inspector after we called the FERC landowner hotline, it was 10 days. It was 11 days later. It was on the 18th. And their first pellets dropped on the 7th. And, we showed them where the pellets were. We showed them what the problem was. We talked about the fact that the hopper that the helicopter was flying around with had no lid, and that was why these pellets were being blown out by the rotor wash. The FERC inspector told them flat out to put a lid on it, get a tarp, do something, so that this doesn't continue to happen. The contacts with Mountain Valley Pipeline told me, hey, we're really sorry this happened. We're going to take care of it. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Their environmental specialist told me when I asked that there was nothing that could be done to mitigate the damages, because the nature of the pellet was that once it got wet, it went into flying over my property, dropping more pellets on me. They literally covered 90% of my property. About the only place they didn't cover was their own right-of-way, which was the only place they would have had any right to do so. And it boils down to, we talk about property owner rights, and here is a company that is taking advantage and utilizing 90% of the property that's not within the right-of-way to drop a non-organic product on, where they had no permission to do so. And ultimately, the only way we got them to stop was to file a cease and desist letter through attorneys. And we tried to work out and negotiate with them to get some sort of compensation to fix the problem, to deal with the damages, and ultimately ended up having to file a lawsuit in federal court because they wouldn't come to the table and try and work with us, despite the fact that that's what they said they were going to do.
It's one of the starkest examples of injustice in terms of this, particular issue that I've witnessed. This has happened with the erosion control pellets up and down the line, and there have been multiple what I would consider violations, and yet they lie. They lie and they get away with it, and there's no repercussions, and it's just.
Well, and where are the agencies that are supposed to be out here protecting us? Why are they not doing their jobs? Why are they allowing Mountain Valley Pipeline to do what would be an instant criminal charge if you or I were to go do this?
Exactly. And they have committed another violation that you documented not too long ago, Neil, correct?
Correct. We had what I consider a very obvious violation in a couple of different ways. One, working within a wetland and building a bridge across it without the water crossing permits. And two, destroying a section of that wetland outside of their right-of-way. And again, this is something that we reported directly to FERC and had the FERC inspector come out for, and nothing came of it, even though it's very clear, well documented, very obvious. It was obvious to the inspector that, they were trafficking and creating a superhighway with their feet across this wetland outside of the right-of-way, in an area where they had no right to be. But again, nobody's going to hold these people accountable, and that's the biggest problem. It's not just the fact that the pipeline is unnecessary, but they're coming through, they're doing things that are not legal, and no one cares. Nobody that has the authority to deal with them and create any kind of responsible action from them is willing to take up the gauntlet and do it. And, I think that's the problem. That's one of the major problems.
It is definitely,
I've got an issue that's going to start for me tomorrow morning where they have told me that they're going to come onto my property. But as part of the agreement and part of my organic certification, I have to have every material that's going to be used approved prior to use. And they have failed to provide that for me. I sent a cease and desist letter, written as nicely as I could, and I have failed to get a response from them. So I fully expect them to come in tomorrow and start the construction process and grubbing process across my property, once again, without following through with their own written requirements for how they deal with me. So here they are getting ready to bully their way across my property and completely ignore and violate our agreements.
And leaving you very little recourse in terms of, anyone who can step in the way and tell them to stop. I mean, it seems as if that should be there. There is the capacity, I know, for the Virginia DEQ to issue an emergency stop work order. So my guess is that the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection has a similar mechanism in place. They could do that. The FERC could do that. As you pointed out, none of the agencies that are supposed to protect us are protecting us. And that's wrong. It's just simply wrong.
For me, a poor farmer from West Virginia, to be able to do anything to get anybody's attention, would have to hire an expensive attorney and pay lots of dollars to even get something in front of a judge. And I can't afford to do that. I think that we would have an opportunity to win because they're violating their agreement with me, and in doing such, they're also violating the agreements with both DEP or DEQ in your case, or my case, DEQ here in West Virginia, as well as FERC. And, there's only so much I can do.
Right. And I think that, the meeting, as I understood it, yielded a little bit of hope based on something that was told to you and Richard. And, Richard, I know that you've maybe done a little research into this. I'm looking at the page on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission website for the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation. Happy to send a screenshot to you or anybody else. There's numbers and contact stuff here in terms of what role they play within the FERC, and it is complex. But there was some indication that, as I understand it, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is currently not under construction because Dominion voluntarily stepped away from construction based on the lawsuit regarding the Appalachian Trail and the crossing of the Appalachian Trail. And there was some insinuation, at least, that if something similar was filed regarding the Mountain Valley Pipeline, then a similar stop work could potentially take place. Am I getting that right?
There's some conjecture involved here, so I want to be sure we're clear about it.
Absolutely.
I'm not confident that I can say that the Atlantic Coast Pipeline stopped work voluntarily because of that permit issue. They also have lost their endangered species permit rights across to the U.S. Forest Service. They've lost their water crossing permits. They've got 7 or so permits that are in question at the moment, and I think that they got beyond tree felling season, and there just wasn't much that they could do. So they, as a PR move, they voluntarily stopped work.
Right.
I do believe they have a very significant structural problem, which is this issue of the AT crossing. That lawsuit they lost originally in the courts at the circuit court level. They then took it to the appeals court and they lost again there. And so they have now appealed to the Supreme Court. And typically the Supreme Court's only going to take cases that either have true constitutional issues to resolve, which this doesn't, or where lower courts are in dispute with one another, right? So we've got multiple courts kind of saying different things. Supreme Court needs to weigh in and sort of establish what is law. And neither of those things apply in this case. So I think it's a real long shot the Supreme Court picks this up at all. And if they don't, the only other mechanism is an act of Congress, or although lately I think there's some concern that we'll get some bizarre executive order that gives them some right. We certainly are seeing those used in ways nobody anticipated. But the exact same legal conditions exist on the MVP. And what we understood is, at least from the FERC staff's perspective, this OEP letter that told them that they claim tells ACP that they can't continue construction, again with the caveat of what that may or may not mean, until they resolve the AT crossing issue. If that letter really says that, then what I understood is a similar letter would be likely, if not ensured, if the MVP had a similar court ruling or legal case being made about their crossing. So that sounds really technical. For the layperson, we would all sort of say, hey, look, if it's illegal for the Forest Service to issue an Appalachian Trail, for the ACP, it must be illegal for them to do it for the MVP as well. So it seems obvious, but there has not yet been a case filed on that issue on the MVP.
Okay, well, that is good to know. And I know that it was confusing as a layperson who hails from Southwest Virginia, to understand precisely why their ACP is not allowed to cross the Blue Ridge Parkway when the MVP already has. That's the only place that they have actually engaged in any construction in the area of Bent Mountain in Roanoke County is across the Blue Ridge Parkway. And you mentioned something, Richard, that I want to clarify, if you can at all, that it would take an act of Congress, because I was told that a long time ago. In order to cross the Appalachian Trail, that it would take an act of Congress, that it is actually something that has to be permitted by the government and not simply a regulatory agency. Is that true? Is that how you understand it as well?
Well, sort of. There's a nuance to that. On federal land. So if you have U.S. Forest Service land, federal land, it requires an act of Congress or some new lawmaking, which is effectively an act of Congress, to make it so that a permit could be granted across the Appalachian Trail. On private land, that's not the case. And so you may have heard recently there's some discussion about MVP looking for some sort of a land swap deal where they would trade to the Forest Service some other land, and the Forest Service would trade out the land that the MVP is crossing, and they would then be on private land. I don't know what the status of that is. It feels like a giant. I mean, it just seems like one illegal thing backing up another, but in any regard, that's the issue. There is no, the Forest Service, the courts have held that the Forest Service has no right to issue a permit to cross the Appalachian Trail anywhere, ever. And Dominion and ACP and MVP will all say, oh, well, what about the 50-something other crossings? SELC, Southern Environmental Law Center, did an exhaustive look at every single one of those crossings, and there is no instance ever before where the Forest Service has granted this permission. It has always been done on existing easements or private land.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. So Neil, what was the visit to the FERC like to actually meet these people? It's difficult for me to imagine, having dealt with them, on paper for 5 years. I don't actually think of them as people sometimes.
And I think to a degree that's part of why it was surreal, because for me, these people are, sitting behind the glass walls up in D.C. and don't, they make decisions that affect everybody out here in the middle of nowhere, and without having to deal with any of the consequences that we do based on their own decisions. And so to sit down with Bernard McNamee and Cheryl LaFleur and to hear them respond and give their attention and treat us as if we were important was not quite, I kind of expected a little bit of aloofness. And, maybe Bernard McNamee was a little bit aloof, but I having only just met him, I can't really gauge his personality as well as maybe perhaps some others. But it gave me an insight to the human side of the commissioners, and both of them were willing to admit that the system was broken, and I think that's a huge element, because it's what we've been saying for a long time now. And if the commission itself is also saying the system is broken, there is maybe an opportunity, if not for these pipelines, but for future projects, to maybe get some of the regulations changed to where there is better definitions for what is pre and or true construction, and or making sure that we don't process a permit and give the authority for quick take until all of the details are ironed out and it's 100% sure. I think that would be a definite plus for us on the ground, and I think that there is some capacity to maybe move towards that going forward.
So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is not actually a federal agency. That's something that I think is tricky for many of us to understand, given the word federal is in their name. But they are technically hired by the government and answer to, as I understand it, the Department of Energy. And their job is to make decisions about these projects, to permit these projects. I may be oversimplifying this a little bit because I try to do that when I'm trying to understand something complex. But that was one of the first things that surprised me about the FERC when I first started doing this work. They're funded by the projects that they approve, so they really have no motivation to disapprove anything if it seems profitable. And I think that's maybe one of the key changes at this point. As much as I do want to find the humanity in each and every person that I encounter, I think perhaps one of the things that's happening at the moment is that the bottom is dropping out and fossil fuel is no longer looking quite as profitable as it used to. So I wonder, Richard, you're very up to date on the issue of quick take, and you explain it very well, and it is pretty confusing. But how do you think that might affect other projects? I mean, are they just going to shift into approving or disapproving renewable energy projects as we have to pretty much quit using fossil fuel cold turkey, in my opinion, and there's a real push to do so by the public? How do you think that will change, if at all? And what are some changes that you think could be made in short order?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in there.
Too many questions at once. I apologize.
It's okay. It's okay. I mean, I agree with Neil in that I think that I do believe that at least 3 of the 4 commissioners that I have met with now have all seemingly openly expressed that they think the process needs to be fixed. And the FERC process and even the Natural Gas Act, under which it really applies to our 2 pipelines, all of this stuff was written at a time when the goal of those things was to facilitate expansion of energy infrastructure into rural and sort of diverse spread markets. Right? I mean, that really was the goal. So they were sort of creative with the idea that they want to enable this kind of work. And then what's happened is we've got this massive explosion in the last few years of natural gas in this country. And as the markets plummet globally and solar rapidly has overtaken cost of production, all of these gas companies have an extraordinary sort of fleeting opportunity. They own all of this, the right to this previously very valuable product. And there is a very limited window in which they can get it out and sell it, or lock us in, captive ratepayers, into deals that allow them to sell it over the next 15 years or so. And otherwise, the bottom's going to drop out of the market. So they're in this mad rush, and the FERC is wholly unprepared for that kind of an environment, right? The rules and all were set up with the opposite idea, which was you were lucky if you got a major infrastructure project every 8 to 10 years. And so they need massive reform. I do believe FERC is going to end up being an agency that begins permitting solar projects and others over time. But I think that they really need to go from the ground up and redo the process. That the way in which they combine eminent domain, conditional permits, and quick take collapses on landowners and communities in a way that takes away all of your rights and all of your power to advocate for yourself. And all of the incentives, as we know, are rigged to encourage exactly the kind of development that Dominion and Duke and EQT and others are doing. I mean, they have managed to get rules on the books which allow them to recoup all of the money they spend. So it's effectively a no-risk investment if they get the thing done, and a 14% rate of return. And so they're doing exactly what the markets have been set up to do. So we've got to have just a whole rethink of that process, and we need to put at the front of it these questions around need, where Neil was talking about how, you know, we should change the order of the conditional permits. I completely agree, and frankly, they need to start with the question of what's necessary, and how do we really truly balance the cost of a project. I don't mean in dollars, I mean the human cost, the environmental cost, the cost to climate, all of those things against the value of the operation. And I am a firm believer that public projects can only be done and owned by the public. And so in an instance where you're ever going to use government authority to take land or property or an asset from someone, it should only ever be done if that asset must be taken in order to accomplish some critical public need, and it should only ever end up being owned by the public. You know, if you're going to ever take an individual or business asset and give it to another individual or business, to me, at face value, it's so obviously wrong. I find it almost impossible to believe we are where we are. So I don't know if that really answered your question, except when I think about the FERC, I realize in a weird way, I don't fault the people, but the system is completely backwards, and it must be fixed. And in an environment where we can't even have a meaningful conversation, where all of the arguments are either, you know, if you don't like energy and you don't want energy independence, then turn off all your electricity and go back to the cave days, you know, versus, hey, let's have a meaningful argument about what's necessary for our communities, what's sustainable for our communities, and how do we work together to get it. I don't know how you fix this stuff.
Well, I think that the latter is precisely what we need, and I appreciate you being able to put it into words, because it is wrong. All of this is wrong. And what's difficult for me sometimes is to separate the bigger picture and all the ways in which the system is corrupt, when my friend Neil is looking at workers in the woods, on the ground, on his property tomorrow morning. With what recourse? You know, what recourse do you have, Neil? Who did you appeal to when you found this out the day you got home from Washington, D.C. and meeting with the FERC?
The only thing I could do was reach out to my attorneys, who did not have time to write a letter for me, so I had to write the letter myself. And I sent it to anybody and everybody I could, specifically to Mountain Valley Pipeline and the person that sent me the letter stating that it would be on my property Monday. And I also included FERC commissioners, the DEP, and everybody else I could. You know, I think, you know, Richard, you made the statement that it was an explosive industry, and I can't agree with you more. With 6 explosive disasters and since the beginning of 2018 in Appalachia alone. It's certainly an explosive industry.
Yeah, that's pretty alarming when you see news reports pretty regularly about pipeline explosions. And they're running these, often running these pipelines within the blast zone, with homes and schools within the blast zone. Especially in more urban areas up in Pennsylvania. It's all pretty rural in Southwest Virginia and West Virginia, but still going through the woods with a source of ignition surrounded by trees is not one of my favorite ideas.
Absolutely not. I mean, you're talking about a blast zone of almost a mile. And you hit that kind of a blast zone in a forest that is, you know, got lots of deadwood in it. How far is that forest fire going to carry?
Yeah. Well, how far is your house from the LOD?
I am in the blast zone.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
Richard is also in the blast zone.
Yeah.
Now, my sister's house is within 100 yards of the LOD, and mine's about 300 yards.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the primary arguments, I think, in this case for due process, because that should have been taken into account before. I mean, your rights are being trampled on left and right, and this is all very much undemocratic and really an affront to the citizens who are involved.
Richard, I have a question for you that is filtering around in the back of my head. Have you done any appraisal work in regards to what your property value would do if the pipeline does go through?
Richard? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So I would say we don't know for sure. We've got some folks working on that. I can tell you that my sister has had her house here for sale for 4 years and hasn't been able to sell it. And in fact, she's had renters move out because last fall, when we believed that they were going to begin trying to cut trees there in the fall. So the economic impact is certainly going to be enormous. But, you know, I mean, I'm not the one to complain specifically because, frankly, I'm lucky. Our family has some resources. But, I mean, I know of families. I know of a woman in Nelson County, and the LOD is 50 feet from her home. And she's an elderly woman with very little resources and nothing she can do about it. And they're not going to buy her out of her house. They've offered to move her out temporarily while they build because they're going to completely block her access. But then she's got to go back in there? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, that's not tenable.
Well, we know that feeling extremely well, Richard, that, you know, that up at with where the easement is, they literally cut through our only access road. And they have told us that when they go to cut the trench across that road, that we're going to have to be removed from the property and they're going to pay for us to stay in a hotel. But then when we come back, we literally will have to drive across that pipe every day we leave or come back from our property. I have to carry my family across that.
And that pipe is toxic. There's questions now, as I understand it, from the FERC about the coatings on that pipe in regards to your organic certification, Neil, in regards to, you know, what the chemicals can do, especially when the pipe is left out in the weather. I have not actually, I know this happened, I believe, right at the, around the time you guys met with them. And we need to pause for just a second for station ID. I'm hoping that one of you can answer that if you have more info.
Yeah, you are listening to WRWK LP-FM 93.9 on your FM dial, based in Midlothian and serving the metropolitan Richmond area and serving the counties of Chesterfield, Henrico, Hanover, Goochland, and Powhatan. This is the Citizen Voices radio show for July 14th, 2019, with your hosts, Jay Tubb and Mara Robbins. We are currently speaking to Neil LaFerrier and Richard Averett. In just a minute, we're going to be having John Sokolow calling in. He'll be on the third line here, and so we'll be able to engage in some dialogue. And Tammy Belinsky will be calling in as well. So that's it for the station ID. And everybody listening, we have a large audience today. Thank you for tuning in. And here we go back to our guests, Neil and Richard.
So, Mara, to answer your question, the product that's in question is a 3M Scotch Coat fusion bonded epoxy coating, 6233. And specifically, there are some issues regarding the pipe sitting out and that coating becoming a powder. The ingredients in it that are of concern are the cyanamide. I can't speak that well. Specifically, the quartz silica is one of the primary concerns, at least from my farm. there are known carcinogens, suspected human carcinogens in the quartz silica, the titanium dioxide, and the fact that the pipe has been sitting out and degrading makes it even more dangerous. Some of these products that are part of the coating, the silica specifically, they will remain in soil for a very long time. I think 36 months. And there's a lot of issues with this, and this is something that I mentioned specifically in my letter Friday to them. In requesting that material information, I mentioned specifically this particular product because there are specific things in here that I feel are a definite violation of my organic certification, and they have failed to address that. Not a full answer to your question, but I think that kind of covers the basics.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm so pleased to welcome our friend John Sokolow to the show. John, are you there?
Hey, John. You there? Oh, well.
I'm sorry, here I am.
There he is. Okay.
Hey, Jay.
Hey there.
Welcome.
Good to hear your voice today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Could you give a brief introduction to our listeners so they know who they're listening to?
Sure. My name is John Sokolow. I live in Northern Virginia. I'm an attorney. I'm a writer, and I'm a lifetime activist, and spent the last few years working on a number of things, including the fight against the Atlantic Coast and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. I've done a lot of writing on those two pipelines, on the fight for environmental justice at Union Hill for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and sort of covered the regulatory failure of this whole process.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate and admire the work that you've done, and glad to be in this fight with you. And full disclosure to all of our listeners, this is true grassroots radio here. So I believe what we're going to try to do, since we have two studio lines, is to keep Richard and Neil on the line so that you guys can ask questions as well if you wish. And certainly if either one of you have to go, let us know. But to bring Tammy Belinsky in on my phone. So we have a very interesting configuration here. Those of you who are watching via Facebook Live can kind of see it. So bear with us. We're trying to get as many voices here at the same time as we can.
Yeah, John, I know you've been listening to the show up to this point. I was curious if you had any comments on what you've heard so far. Your input would be valuable.
Sure. Yeah, I was listening to some of Richard and Neil's comments. First of all, I'm up here in the comfort of Northern Virginia, but I've got to say the true heroes in this fight against both these pipelines are the people who are on the front lines, people like Richard, people like Neil, and many others who've really taken on what seemed at first, I think, an unwinnable fight these billion-dollar companies to try to get some justice for themselves and for our environment. I'm struck by the comments that the FERC commissioners made to Neil, I guess, and to Richard on their visit last week, and I commend them on meeting with the commissioners, and I'm glad the commissioners took the time to meet. I wonder about that the issue that you just went over a few minutes ago regarding why there's no stop work order on the Mountain Valley Pipeline. I got to say that puzzles me. The ruling on the on the Appalachian Trail with regard to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline technically applied just to that pipeline. It has created a lot of problem for them. But in the Fourth Circuit case that made that decision, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which was not a party to the case, filed a friend of the court, it's called an amicus brief, with the Fourth Circuit, and essentially said that if this ruling stands, they can't build their pipeline. So they're on record as saying the ruling applies to them, which was maybe one of the one times in this entire saga they've actually told the truth. So there is at least a public record that it applies. I don't know exactly what FERC is getting at, but the lawyers who are handling the Mountain Valley litigation should take a hard look at those comments and see if something can be done to rectify that particular issue.
Wow. Well, yeah. That's a good ask. I hope that we can get that issue in front of those lawyers. I mean, at this point, there are many people who just want the stop work order. We've been hollering for it, showing up at Mark Herring's house in Leesburg, even to try to get him to do something. So it really seems like there is a whole level of collusion between the government and industry in this case, which is really disappointing because, as Richard was pointing out, there's a lack of due process.
Absolutely. Yeah, these pipeline fights are really an example of a regulatory failure, and not even really regulatory failure, but regulatory capture at both the federal and the state level. It's not surprising, many of us, that the federal government, controlled by Donald Trump at this point, who's appointing commissioners to FERC, is not taking decisive action to protect the environment. That shouldn't shock anybody. What is shocking to me as a Virginian is that our Department of Environmental Quality and Secretary of Natural Resources, Matt Strickler, and the governor, all of whom got elected in part on a platform of being environmentally good stewards of our environment, are doing absolutely nothing to protect the environment when it comes to these pipelines.
Yeah, I mean, I keep seeing what really appears by the governor, especially by Governor Northam, to be window dressing, greenwashing efforts to make himself look like he's doing something. But, you know, he's talking about reducing carbon emissions by 30% by 2030, which is really slow movement and obviously done to appease his major funding source, which is the fossil fuel industry, primarily Dominion, as we've have suspected for quite some time.
Yeah, if you follow these things closely, it becomes really farcical. A couple of weeks ago, Department of Environmental Quality put out a tweet and urged Virginians, particularly in Northern Virginia, to have a no mow day, meaning don't mow your lawn because mowing your lawn with a gas powered mower can create greenhouse gases, and you don't want to do that. It's farcical. At the same time, they're approving 2 pipelines that are going to emit the equivalent of 45 coal-fired power plants when it comes to greenhouse gases, and then telling Virginians that the failure to protect our environment is your fault because you're mowing your backyard or your front yard. It's just if it wasn't so sad and terrifying, it would be funny.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, because I know the effect of fracking and shipping the gas through pipelines and the leaks and every step of the way involved is releasing methane and other associated gases into the environment. And they've been billing this gas as a clean alternative to coal, when it's that's just such a misleading statement when you realize that it's much larger greenhouse gas, but you know you can't see methane. You can see smoke from coal, and that's just it's causing our planet to have severe climate change as the evidence is all around.
I would call it a catastrophe at the moment. And we do have technology now that can allow us to see methane. I strongly encourage everybody to watch the movie Blowout, which we'll talk about at a later date. We have Tammy Belinsky on the line, I hope. Tammy, can you hear us?
I I can hear you, Mara.
Okay, excellent. So you are here with John Sokolow and Neela Ferrier from Summers County, West Virginia, and Richard Avert from Nelson County. And we're talking about their visit to the FERC last Wednesday.
Hey, I don't want to cut Tammy off here because she's got lots of great things to say, but I wanted to make one comment, if I may, about the money issue that you and Jonathan were just touching on. Is that all right?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, please.
Okay, so one of the things I think we need to continue to demand as a citizenry is the same kinds of sort of obvious arm's length between our elected officials and the organizations that they regulate. And, I've met with Tane and Northam and all the rest of them, and they all make this comment, well, their money doesn't affect me, and it's a small amount anyway, and blah, 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 blah. But here's the thing. And they equate it to taking money from any other corporation. And we have lots to talk about corporate finance, of course, or election finance reform and the ways in which corporations effectively are owning our government today. But even with that, it is a very different thing to take money from a corporation like Pfizer or Coca-Cola or something, who we may also not want to have as much influence as they have. But it's still different to do that than to take money from Dominion. When as an elected official, you have an express responsibility to make regulatory-based decisions about what Dominion can charge, when they can build, the things they can do with the ratepayers. This is an organization you uniquely regulate, not tangentially regulate with regular laws, but explicitly are in charge of. And the argument that money doesn't influence front to the citizenry. We won't let doctors get golf trips from pharmaceutical companies anymore. We don't let judges preside over cases where they have a relationship with one of the people. I mean, it's just absurd that we tolerate that in this state. And I'll tell you right now, if I was any one of these officials, what do they need the money for? If you need it, you only need it for one thing, and that's advertising to win campaigns, right? And if that's true, but you could win thousands and thousands of votes and do an extraordinary job for your credibility by saying, I won't take Dominion's money. And it doesn't have to be because you think Dominion's a bad actor. It just has to be that it is inappropriate to take that money from an organization which you then have to turn around and regulate. Full stop.
Conflict of interest, pure and simple.
I have a feeling that Tammy may have some commentary on that if she could hear you well. And Tammy, if you could take just a minute to introduce yourself to our listeners and who you are and where you're calling from. Tammy, you still there?
Thank you.
Yeah.
And hi, Richard. Hi, Neil. Hi, Jay. I'm an attorney in the Blackstone of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And I didn't listen to the first part of the show, so I apologize, but I did hear this discussion or this comment about politicians taking money from Dominion. And it's not just Dominion. It's, there's quite a web of money funnels to politicians, and so you even have to be careful about taking money that comes from Ralph Northam and comes from the House PACs and the Senate PACs, because they mask the sources of those donations. And we heard, and maybe you've talked about this already, that Mountain Valley Pipeline donated $10,000 to Ralph Northam or Ralph Northam's campaign or his war chest or whatever it is, and then that money is more than likely going to get redistributed out to candidates in the election this fall. And so candidates could be taking dirty money and not even know it. But we have, I think Mara might have been alluding to the fact that a group of us have gotten together to form our own PAC to to raise money from individuals, from people who are concerned about our climate emergency and want to support candidates who will act on that concern. So People Power Virginia was formed late this spring. There's going to be a press release launching the PAC this week, and we're going to start doing some fundraising. And so if people don't know where to contribute their money to candidates, if people have money that they want to help candidates who oppose pipelines, who are also opposed, one of our characteristics or qualities that we're looking for is candidates who are opposed to increasing the penalties for civil disobedience and climate action. We've seen the laws being proposed and adopted in other states that make your First Amendment rights felonies. And so we want to support candidates who will oppose that kind of legislation in Virginia. You know, the environmental justice aspects of fossil fuel development. So People Power Virginia is out there, and hopefully we will be getting some attention by raising money that gets other politicians' attention.
That sounds really like a really powerful tool. We will definitely spread the word about that from the show here. I'll post a link on the show today. And are there any events coming up for that group that you know of?
We are planning small house party styled fundraisers with candidates in the room with us, but people can donate through our Facebook page anytime they'd like. People Power Virginia.
I'm looking at a picture of the People Power Virginia site with a whole bunch of Protect Our Water and Stand with Red T-shirts and signs, and I do think that taking over politics at this point is necessary in whatever way we can, given all of the elements that we need to utilize in order to successfully win this fight, which we will. And so legal, political, direct action, it all works hand in hand. And I think that at this point, I'm really proud of us. We are all doing a good job of working together. You know, those of us just here on the line, I think, have a deep understanding and recognition of a diversity of tactics. And I really appreciate having the legal expertise at the moment. Jonathan and Tammy, I'm wondering whether Neil or Richard have any questions for either of you, or vice versa, based, you know, specifically on the FERC this week, given that there was a lot of attention paid to that, and there was also a lot of financial news this week that I kind of wonder how that played into the whole thing. But Neil, do you have any questions for Jonathan or Tammy?
I guess my question would be, how do we as landowners, I guess that it actually boils down to one of the questions and one of the things that we were asking of her is getting notification and getting information sooner, because I know I'm not the only landowner that was not aware of this until much later into the process, but there's so little information out there for what to do, how to do it. So the process is involved, even down to, becoming an intervener with FERC and what our rights are. As Richard was talking about earlier, for those of us that are not legal experts, there's so much that we don't know. We don't even know where to go to find that information out. I think, you know, if we can create a way to make that more accessible to the folks that don't have that information, it would be a big plus. How can we get that information into landowners' hands along projects faster in the future? And you know, what else can we do to help ourselves be self-aware of what we can do?
This is Tammy, and I'm sorry, but you're speaking generally about getting information, and you're going to need to be a little more specific about what it is you want to get into landowners' hands.
Neil, can you hear Tammy? She just asked you to be a little bit more specific about what it is you want to get into landowners' hands.
I think the knowledge of where to go, who to ask, what to ask, I think those are all valid things that we as landowners having to deal with this didn't know. And, you know, talking with some of the people along the project, even north of us in northern West Virginia, they still don't know. You know, I think of MJ, who is just now coming online in the battle over the last few months, who didn't know there was a compressor station going in her backyard, because even the local community and the county commissioners and stuff like that, they were kind of keeping it silent. So I guess from that perspective, just, you know, the ability for us to get that information into affected people's hands faster and the right information, because it's, even now, I mean, it's just like with what I'm doing now, I don't know where to go to try and file an injunction to stop Mountain Valley Pipeline from every, you know, specifically in relation to them violating their agreement with me and violating my contracts for organic certification. You know, where do we go? How do we get there? Where is that information?
It sounds like we need a legal defense manual.
It does, Jay, and you know, there's so many things that we come across and so many questions, and there's so many particulars in relation to dealing with pipeline companies. And, you know, what do we have as rights as landowners? Because it feels from our end that they can just run roughshod over us, and we have to wait to the end to figure out what our rights are and what we can do.
Well, Neil, I'd like to speak at least briefly to your question and say one of the answers is community organizing, is going into communities and helping make people aware of these resources, whether it's at a farmer's market or, you know, a library meeting. But perhaps the question for Jonathan and for Tammy is, you know, what would that information be? One of the things Preserve Floyd did early on was to provide a piece of information called Know Your Rights for landowners, that we compiled everything that we could find about what your rights are as landowners. And that's changed some in 5 years, but not a whole lot, because the system is still pretty much just as broken as it was back then. But, you know, do either of you, you know, maybe you could both speak to this question, you know, what would be the most valuable information to provide given the complexity of this, in terms of landowners having some recourse in this, especially ones who are new to the game?
Yeah, this is John. I think, first of all, Neil's question is exactly on point. I mean, people are out there facing these corporations, facing these pipelines, and don't know their rights, and don't even know what's going on. Mara, your comment about community organizing, I think, is the answer. People need to know, number one, the facts, and people need to know, number two, their legal rights. And what that requires is community organizations banding together, getting in touch with attorneys. One bright spot, I think, in this whole fight, and I agree with Mara's point that we're winning when it comes to both the Mountain Valley and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And I know that's a charged subject. We can get into the details of it, but that's my view. But one of the bright elements of this is there's been an excellent legal defense on both pipelines, and there's a whole constellation of community organizations in the Allegheny Blue Ridge Alliance and dozens of others organizations that have gotten together to fight both of these pipelines. People are educating themselves. Most folks didn't know, a whole lot about methane or compressor stations or even what a compressor station was. I sure didn't know what a compressor station was till I got involved in this. So it's a question of getting in touch. If you're a landowner out there affected and you don't know what's going on and you don't know what your rights are, you need to plug into the lawyers who are involved in these fights, Appalachian Mountain Advocates and the Southern Environmental Law Center, among others. And you need to plug into the community organizations that have been doing this work, I guess, for about 5 years with regard to both of these pipelines. So that's, I think, the short answer to Neil's question. But Neil, you're exactly right. People feel very vulnerable out there not knowing what's going on and feeling like they're alone. And the answer is you're not alone. You've got a lot of support out there, a lot of organizations who are with you and are trying as best as we all can to fight this fight.
I'll suggest that Neil and Richard were guests, or they were hosted by a nonprofit, the Niskanen Center. Is that what it's called? And I've spoken to the attorney that was with you at your meeting with the commissioners, and their sole focus is landowners. And so I suggest to you that you reach out to the Niskanen Center. Please, anybody who wants to correct me, please do on the pronunciation of that organization, and express to them that there is a need for tools for landowners to be available. They have the resources, and landowners are their focus. They were not they told me landowners are their focus. So I think that they have the resources and should be the one that's asked to develop the kinds of tools you're looking for that could then be distributed by the community organizations. In other words, every community doesn't need to reinvent the wheel if someone like Niskanen can keep a product like that up, a resource tool like that up to date. But the bottom line is that the whole system is really designed to keep you powerless. And landowners certainly do have rights, but the eminent domain aspect of this really strips you of those rights. So more needs to be done to, there's needs that, I know that there are some efforts looking at FERC reform, and it's difficult because of the makeup of Congress, but those issues need to be brought up in the context of reforming the FERC as well, because the whole process is designed to keep you down and keep you powerless.
And this all takes some time. And I think that perhaps the question you're asking, Neil and Richard, I'd actually love to hear your take on this. All of these things are important. They're crucial. The legal work that has happened has been, innovative and brilliant, and much of it is, succeeding, at least to some degree, especially within the Fourth Circuit Court here in Virginia, as I understand it. However, it takes a lot of time. And when you have corporate criminals on your property cutting down trees, you don't really feel like you've got the time to allow the wheels of quote unquote justice to turn, which is why I think, one answer to your question is that you stand in the way. That's what Red Terry did on her property and was arrested for trespassing on her own property. Those charges were dropped. There are some precedents set for charges being dropped in places like Pennsylvania with the Lancaster 7 here recently, and yet there's also felony charges being issued to certain protesters in West Virginia. So it's certainly not anywhere close to a precise science, nor is it, shall we say, glamorous, the idea of direct action and standing in the way. And yet that has continued to be recently one of the only things that's actually holding them back, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, from constructing in some places. And I'm curious, Richard, as to what your perspective is on this, and also whether you have any questions for John and Tammy.
Yeah, thank you, Mara. I do. I mean, I am deeply grateful for those folks who have decided that civil disobedience is a necessary measure. And I think that, you know, we have a lot of history in this country of proving that when laws are really, really wrong and rigged against a group of citizens or all citizens, often it is civil disobedience is required in order to capture the attention of the broader community and get change. And so I think we're going to continue to see more of it, you know, and it sucks that that's where it is, because it's asking a lot of those individuals who take that step. I mean, they're risking taking time and risking money and arrest and all of those things. And yet it is something that has proven over and over again in this country and others to be required for big social change, I think. Related to MVP, and maybe something that helps us not have to have people take those steps. Jonathan said something that fascinated me a little bit ago, and I wanted to ask he and Tammy both, that I didn't realize that MVP had done an amicus brief in this case on ACP, and that it sort of acknowledged in advance that they had the exact same conditions. And that certainly seems like a sort of slam dunk, that any condition around crossing the Appalachian Trail that exists for the ACP should exist for the MVP. And God, we need to do something that stops the outrageous destruction they're doing on the MVP. I mean, they have just had a damn the torpedoes mentality all along, and just haven't cared what the law was. They'll pay any penalties and fines and forge ahead. And so what can we do to help provide the level of political cover, of insistence, of whatever, to say at a time when we have really deep uncertainty about what will happen with either of these pipelines, where there is very little remedy to solve this Appalachian Trail crossing, and it certainly could be years in the making, even if they get one. We should be and need to be insisting that no more damage is done to our communities and to our national forests and parks and water and property rights, with that uncertainty in mind. It is completely outrageous that we would risk creating hundreds of more families like the Hallorans in Pennsylvania, when we know that there is certainly less than a 50% chance, maybe less than a 20% chance, that these pipelines ever are completed.
Right. The companies involved, like EQT, are billions of dollars in debt to banks. And so they're desperate to get some profit going so they can pay it back. But it's ludicrous. They pay the amount of money they pay out to their workers, and they're not even passing that on to the landowners for damages. It's just pure greed.
I believe your question had to do with the amicus brief, Richard. If there was a way in which either, Jonathan, if you or Tammy wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that since I had mentioned it. The case. First of all, just to back up a second, so people really need to remain hopeful here, and I'm just going to say something I've been saying for a long time, and it's important enough I'm going to actually say it twice so people really get the point. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has thrown out every single federal permit for the Atlantic Coast and the Mountain Valley Pipeline that it has considered. They've thrown out every single federal permit for the Atlantic Coast and the Mountain Valley Pipeline that it is considered. This is the Fourth Circuit.
Jonathan, let me make sure I heard you right. They have thrown out every single federal permit.
That every permit that has been litigated to a decision, in other words, that they've made a decision on in the Fourth Circuit, they've thrown it out. So what does that look like? They've thrown out a National Park Service permit for the to cross the Blue Ridge Parkway for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. They've thrown out a Fish and Wildlife permit. They've thrown out permits to cross the Jefferson National Forest in the case of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and the George Washington National Forest in the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. There's issues going on with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Environmental and Endangered Species Act. In fact, there was a letter, I'm not sure if this came up earlier, but in just getting myself up to date for this show, 2 days ago, FERC sent a letter to Mountain Valley Pipeline demanding that they answer some questions about impact to endangered species, to bats, to birds, and interestingly, that they quantify the impact of the pipeline construction activity on greenhouse gases. So there's a lot, as I think Richard used the word, he's absolutely right. There's a lot of uncertainty going on. Now, getting back to the question with the Appalachian Trail, the Fourth Circuit, a panel of the Fourth Circuit, a three-judge panel, ruled that the National Forest Service violated the law by authorizing a crossing of the Appalachian Trail for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And the reason they violated the law is because the Appalachian Trail is a unit of the National Park Service, and the Forest Service, which is a distinct entity, had no right to issue that permit, which is why they've never issued such a permit. After that three-judge decision, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline filed for what's called an en banc review, which is meaning not just for the three judges who already decided the case, but for the 15 or so judges who actually comprise the entire Fourth Circuit. When that happened, when they filed that petition for en banc review, Mountain Valley Pipeline weighed in and said, yeah, me too. If this decision, this outrageous decision, is not reversed, we're not going to be able to build the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And the full Fourth Circuit not only refused to reverse the panel decision, they refused to even consider it. They took a poll of the judges, and understand at this point the Fourth Circuit is majority Republican. They took a poll of the judges, and not a single judge wanted to push forward and reconsider the decision made by the three-judge panel. So now the case is, and I think Richard and Neil were talking about this, Atlantic Coast Pipeline is trying to get the Supreme Court to review it, and they filed papers on June 25th, I think, or June 24th, supported by the Trump administration, to try and reverse what the Fourth Circuit panel did. But yes, the answer to the question is absolutely. The Mountain Valley Pipeline is on record saying not only the decision applies to them, but that it would be disastrous to their plans to build the Mountain Valley Pipeline.
Then why hasn't that stopped it? I mean,
well,
why hasn't it stopped it? It seems, you guys are the lawyers, right? I'm not. And Tammy has tried to explain this to me many times, and I don't get it. Why hasn't that stopped it? There are so many reasons that I can see legally that it should have been stopped, but at least half a dozen times.
Well, the short answer to your question, Mara, is the Mountain Valley Pipeline has not been stopped because Ralph Northam, Matt Strickler, and David Paler refused to do their job. That's the short answer. I don't have any better answer than that. Virginia has clear legal authority. Forget about their legal authority to revoke their Clean Water Act certification, which is a whole other subject. They have the authority to issue a stop work order, which is exactly what Dominion has essentially imposed on itself with regard to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and they just refuse to act. Mm-hmm. Instead, we find out that 2 weeks ago, Ralph Northam took another $10,000 from the Mountain Valley Pipeline. They're shameless.
Mm-hmm.
They try to pawn it off as it's somebody else's fault, and there is enough blame to go around. But the Mountain Valley Pipeline has not been stopped. Construction has not been stopped because of the failure of and I say this as a Democrat, the failure of the Democratic administration in Virginia to do a damn thing to stop it.
So Tammy,
well, in addition, FERC also in this
wait, hold on. Neil or Tammy, draw straws here, because we can't hear you if you're both talking at the same time. Tammy, I want your take on that. Let me get a brief response here from Neil.
I just beeped myself out several times in regards to the crooks that are failing to do their jobs. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Tammy, would you agree with John on this point, or what did you have to say?
Sure, Virginia's stop work statute is not our friend. I'm sorry to say that statute was written by industry for industry, and before that statute was even enacted, the state of Virginia had unfettered, unqualified, unconditioned, no strings attached authority to stop work. So the statute that precedes the new stop work statute for pipelines gave them unfettered authority to stop work. They added this statute that adds qualifications and conditions and due process and hearings and notice, and it's limited to site by site, case by case. And we heard that that's how, at the last State Water Control Board meeting, that now that's their focus. Now that's how they're responding to the public entirely, is that they're treating the project on a square foot by square foot basis instead of the systemic problems as a whole. But really, FERC, I mean, Jonathan, you just heard that they've asked for more information, and they've asked for more information because the Fish and Wildlife Service got a scathing letter from the log perch expert that tore up the biological opinion. And on April 14th, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service admitted to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that they're in violation of the Endangered Species Act, and that they both, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and FERC, have the duty and the authority to reinitiate consultation and stop work while they assess all of the information that they should have had before they even issued their biological opinion. Same with these pipe coatings. Should have had it before. Same with Jonathan, you mentioned another issue in addition to the Endangered Species Act questions that FERC apparently just filed a letter about. So I am of the opinion that at this point the pressure should be on FERC. The Democrats have failed us, and I'm officially partyless. I'm partyless, people. But FERC should be reinitiating consultation. You ask why, Mara? The reason is because FERC is lawless, and I had a staff member of Senator Kaine question my assertion that FERC is lawless last Tuesday in a telephone conversation, and so as a result of that, I've written a commentary to the Roanoke Times that will be published hopefully this week that just walks you right through how lawless FERC is.
And that, I think, is part of the issue, that it was humanized for sure this week. And I'm, pleased to hear that Cheryl LaFleur is sorry for what she did and, apologized to the Hollerins. And yet there's no accountability there. There's no enforcement. It's lip service. And it seems to me that some of the legal cases, I mean, Jonathan, that's all well and good what you just said about the Fourth Circuit Court. And yet, Tammy, you were involved intimately in a lawsuit that was with the Forest Service last year that resulted in our only, brief stop work order and should have stopped it and didn't. So I mean, it seems to me like a game of hot potato. It's the FERC, it's our politicians, it's whoever, but, you know, nobody's willing to stop it. And that's really frustrating to those of us who keep trying to figure out why. So, I really appreciate everybody's feedback. And I think, the
real why is money.
Yes.
Yes. It's not at my money, and it's not your money, and it's not Neil's money. It's the investors' money and the money that's being paid to the politicians.
Right. And
let me just add a little something here, if I can, Mara.
Sure.
Just as and I don't think it's a useful debate to necessarily to say should we focus on FERC or should we focus on the state level. I think we need to do all of the above.
Yes.
And as citizens of the Commonwealth of Virginia, I think we have an opportunity and a duty to pressure our elected representatives to put pressure up the food chain to those who are elected to protect our environment, understanding that the Virginia Constitution guarantees clean air and clean water to every resident of the state. So I think they need to be held accountable. Just an illustration of what can be done. People know, I think, that there's a big battle with regard to the compressor station that Dominion plans to build in Union Hill, a historic African-American community in Buckingham County. We've been fighting for 5 years now to try to get that stopped. I think we will successfully stop it. It's now in the Fourth Circuit. We tried very hard to get Ralph Northam to speak out against citing that compressor station in a historically African-American community, given the health effects that it would have. He refused to speak out. But at the same time he was doing that, he got on a radio show up north, with a large audience, WTOP in the D.C. area, and was asked about a different compressor station that Dominion planned to build in Maryland, and asked if he was concerned that they were going to build that. That compressor station in Maryland was in a historic African-American or majority African-American community. But the question that was posed to him was, are you concerned because it's going to be, that compressor station can be seen, the smokestacks from that compressor station can be seen from George Washington's plantation at Mount Vernon. And Governor Northam said, yes, I'm very concerned about the view from Mount Vernon. And a week later, Dominion canceled the project. Just like that. It didn't take sit-ins. It didn't take people climbing in trees. It didn't take decisions by courts. It didn't take editorials in the newspaper. It took Ralph Northam just opening his mouth and deciding that that it was important to him that the former slave plantation at Mount Vernon could enjoy its viewshed, and it was stopped. So I think I just use that as an example, not only of the hypocrisy of our elected officials, but the fact that we as citizens can get something done if we pressure our elected officials, and we need to keep doing it.
Indeed. Well said, Jonathan. Thank you.
Agreed.
Yeah. We need
Our elected officials in Virginia could be asking FERC to enforce the Endangered Species Act. We have our own Endangered Species Act in Virginia. The Department of Game and Inland Fisheries is responsible for protecting the log perch in Virginia. And they're all sitting with their thumbs up their asses, and they're not our elected officials could be asking FERC to protect our endangered species and reinitiate consultation, and they won't do it.
Yeah, I think that's correct. On the question of where people's thumbs are, I will say that that I know several elected officials, particularly in Southwest Virginia, Sam Rasool, Chris Hurst, have been active, and I think Delegate Rasool, in fact, sent a letter to FERC specifically on the endangered species issue and the question of consultation and all of that. So, but so there was some of it.
Right. Sam is the exception, and
yes, yeah, exactly. But you're absolutely right. And the politics of this, I'll just say, as somebody who lives in Northern Virginia, the problem is not in Southwest Virginia. The problem is in Northern Virginia, and in the larger population centers where particularly with regard to Northern Virginia, politicians like to check the box to assure everybody that in their base that they're progressive, but actually do nothing to fight the corporate powers that need to be fought in these battles. So that needs to change, and the way it's going to change, the only way it's going to change, is if people pressure those elected officials to get engaged in these fights.
And that's all. That is very true. And yet, I want to put the spotlight back on Neil here, given that he is actually in harm's way and is facing construction.
Let me respond.
Yes, by all means.
Thing here.
Yes.
The reason I was talking to Tim Kaine's staff on Tuesday was to get Tim Kaine to write a letter to FERC. Tim Kaine, who is a statewide elected official, U.S. Senator, had early in this process said the only way in which he was willing to help his electorate in these pipeline fights or in the pipeline wars was to engage on procedural issues. So we were talking to his staff about the fact that this reinitiation of consultation is a procedural matter. Please ask FERC to stop work. And so I look forward to getting back in touch with you all about Tim Kaine's response to that request.
Yes.
Thank you, Mara.
Please do. And I mean, Tim Kaine has pretty much focused only on the FERC, so far as I can tell, over the years, because I've had a couple of conversations with him myself. My heart's with Neil and his family at the moment. And I'm glad that there are a lot of people who are pressuring a lot of different politicians, agencies, whatever, because, Neil's got a triage right now. And those folks who are standing in the line of fire, and by line of fire, I mean Elliston was burning a week and a half ago, where they were burning the easement. We have Jamie Hale joining us in a few minutes to talk about the situation on the ground. And I think Neil asked a question earlier, what is our recourse? There are a lot of angles have been explored, and I think they're all productive. Knowing what to do as a resident, as someone who's looking this in the face tomorrow morning, is a whole different thing. And so I encourage those of you who are listening who are potentially not directly affected, because we all are directly affected in some way or another, but those who are not facing actual construction and MVP workers on their property in the morning, to do all of these other things, so that Neil can do what he has to do, which, as I understand it, Neil is, seeking some help simply to document what they're doing, because they commit violations all the time, as evidenced by the 300 plus in our Attorney General's lawsuit against the MVP at the moment. Is that pretty much what you're looking at the moment as someone who's standing in the line of fire?
It is, Maura. It's disheartening sometimes because there isn't enough resources. There aren't enough resources to go around, and when you're dealing with something as specific as an organic certification and organic regulations that we have to abide by, and that Mountain Valley Pipeline, just by coming on the property, is violating those. I cannot be up here 24/7 to monitor. My family is at the point where they're ready to give in and give up, and I am the only one standing in the gap right now to try and continue to put pressure on Mountain Valley Pipeline to do the right thing and to not come across our property until at least all of their agreement with me has been met. And we do need help. We need people to help monitor, and we need a lot more people, not just for ourselves, but for the entire movement overall, to stand up and lift their voices up to be heard. We need people to show up by the thousands when we decide to, stand in front of Governor Northam's mansion and get him to pay attention, because it's so far we haven't, it doesn't seem like anything we do can get them to pay attention. As long as that money keeps going in his back pocket, he's going to continue to ignore us. But it is, I don't ever like to feel like I'm in a desperate situation, but right now I am. I'm in a very desperate situation because I don't have a recourse. I don't have any organization, or representation that's going to come out and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong. That's going to say, you can't do this. And that's what I have to deal with in the morning, and it sucks.
Yeah, we need a quick take against MVP, and particularly in your case. I know you've been really financially handicapped by their actions, direct actions that will take years in court to get any kind of compensation for what they've done to you, just financially, not to mention the emotional toll it's taken on your family. I mean, I know your daughters had nightmares.
We're not scheduled to be in court until June. I think June 20th of next year is our first actual court action, and that's without any delays. And as I'm sure the two attorneys on the line can attest, there will always be delays. We can't sell our product off our property because we have a moral and ethical obligation to ensure that our product is 100% pure, and we can't do that because of the pellets. And now we're even questioning whether we'll be able to do that because of the coating on the pipeline going into the soil and into our waterways that feed all of our plants and our trees and our shrubs and our product. How do we justify that? How do we work around that? We don't know, I wish we had an answer.
Exactly. It's a pretty desperate place that they put you into, out there in the woods, without, it's your property that should be a sacrosanct. I mean, certainly by everything that I was raised an American to believe in, this is such an affront and a violation of our trust in the government and due process, in the legal system, and in our fellow men. I know the workers are.
It goes beyond just being our property. It was our hope. It was our dream. It was our plan. It's our future. It's my children's future.
Yeah, well, I know I will add a link to the show today for the fundraiser for Blackberry Springs Farm, because as a community, we need to come together and let the voices be heard, such as yours, Neil, and yours, Richard, and also John and Tammy. And we're going to be having Jamie Hale on shortly. There's so many people affected that it's unfortunate that it takes things like this, but there's a real coming together, and we need to support each other, and spread the word, because a lot of people are just, I hate to say it, they're living in a complacency bubble until something like what has happened to Neil and to Richard happens. Then it's a wake-up call that it's a slippery slope, and it takes vigilance to keep these things from happening. And we're going to be having Jamie on shortly, and John, I'd like to keep you on. I can let Richard. Is there anything that you want to say to wrap up your part of the show?
No, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Tammy and Jonathan and Mara and Neil, especially to you. My heart goes out to you, man. So we should do everything we can to insist on a stop work order on both of these projects. All the evidence is there that they shouldn't be built, and the courts have upheld those decisions. So I think now's the time for a much broader public outrage.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. And I really appreciate your being on the show today and everything you had to say.
Thank you.
Yeah. Neil, do you want to say anything else?
I'd like to ask a question and maybe have both Jonathan and Tammy spend a little more time expounding or explaining what more we can do to continue to put pressure. Because, in listening to what we have already in place in the courts and the wins that we have, we should by all rights have a stop order by now, but we don't. What else can we do to put that pressure on to get that stop work order? I think, yes, we understand we need to do it, but what can we do? What are the next steps? What actions do we need to take? I think it's important not to just say, hey, we need to do something, but to also understand what we can do and maybe, figure out an action that will follow suit and put, action behind those words.
Thank you, Neil. We need to break just a moment for station identification.
Yeah, you're listening to WRWK LP-FM, based in Midlothian, Virginia, 93.9 on your FM dial, and online on Facebook at the Work FM and online at theworkfm.org. You're listening to the Citizen Voices radio show for July 14th, 2019. And we're currently speaking with Neil LaFerriere, Tammy Belinsky from Southwest Virginia, and Jonathan Sokolow from Northern Virginia. Both Tammy and John are lawyers that have been fighting with everything they can and writing about the pipeline fight and trying to protect the people who are being affected.
And I would like to welcome Jamie Hale from Giles County, Virginia, to the line. Jamie is well known for his resistance garden, and he was tempting me to try to determine what he might be cooking at the moment. Jamie, what you got cooking?
I can't say.
Well, Tammy had to go attend to some resistance work, and so we are trading out Jamie for Tammy. Do we still have Richard Averett from Nelson County on the line?
No, Richard
had to go.
Yep.
Okay, so Tammy, if you have the opportunity to call back in, we do have one studio line free, and we also have a studio line free for anyone who might have questions. We can try to get you in. So Jamie, and we still have John Sokolow. Yes, you introduced him. So Jamie was present yesterday in eastern Montgomery County when one of our long-term tree sitters, Philip, actually put his body in the line of the easement in order to block construction as it gets nearer and nearer to the Yellowfinch blockade, which has been in the air now for 323 days, I believe, if I have that right. So, Jamie, can you give us a report of what happened yesterday?
Right. There was a friend of ours on the LOD in Elliston, Virginia, and somehow found himself inside of a hole. Yeah, kind of deal.
Can you call him later?
So I believe that he held back construction for about 6 hours.
Yeah, somewhere around 6 to 7 hours, somewhere in that range. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. And one of the things that concerned me was that there was an ambulance on the scene yesterday.
Yeah, you know, in this heat, you know, it's 90 degrees. Humidity is up. We got a bad storm in the Gulf of Mexico. It's harsh conditions. You know, you're in the mountains in the direct sun. Dehydration authorities kind of take the water from folks most of the time. So, you know, you're without water and food. And
so Philip is okay though today.
Now, as far as I know, I'm hoping he's resting today. You know, being Sunday and all. I hope he's doing well and resting, rehydrating. I know yesterday that he was suffering from dehydration and you know, fatigue kind of deal.
Indeed, yeah. So I'm really grateful Philip was in the oak tree, I believe, at the Yellowfinch Blockade for months last fall.
Yes. You know, people who are willing to live in trees and put their bodies on the line, and something that not a lot of folks know, if those who tuned into the Appalachians Against Pipelines Facebook page, if you notice the great big tree that was over top of his body, we're talking 1,000 pounds easy. Actually, state investigator for the state of Virginia, when they brought our friend to the magistrate's office, he actually come to me because, you know, I was basically his ride. So they come to me and said, you know, your friend is dehydrated. He needs some electrolytes, Gatorade, that kind of deal. So, you know, he was in pretty rough shape. You know, 6 hours in 90-degree hot sun. You know, it's harsh, and you know, it was like, you know, the state investigator tried to talk to me and say, you know, you're the older adult here. He's young. He's impressionable. I should be kind of showing him, you know, a better way to resist instead of putting his life on the line, because the state investigator told me he could have gotten killed very, very easily. And you know, when folks realize that, you know, if we don't do something now, that not only one person could die from this pipeline, but a lot of folks could actually lose their life because of this pipeline. You know, so, you know, people are willing to sacrifice, you know, by making ice, digging in dumpsters looking for food, and yes, we are resourceful. We let nothing go to waste. So
thank you, Jamie. I wonder if you could give our listeners an idea of what it looks like on the ground in eastern Montgomery as they proceed with construction activity there.
It's smoky. They're burning good timber we could leave for oxygen, or we could use for toilet paper. Yeah. So it's smoky, it's dusty, it's dry right now. We have had a lot of rain off and on, but it's dry right now, so it's very dusty. The traffic is very congested. A lot of big trucks on small single lane, not real safe roads. People don't really realize until you sit in the center of this devastation. And, you know, with like Neil and the farm that's being not only destroyed, but they are being bullied. Either you give up your rights, or we'll just destroy everything that's around you, your family, your organic farms, your roads, your mountains. We'll destroy your water sources. Like the log perch, you know, I know about the log perch. It's endangered, same as the brown mountain lizard. In the state of Virginia, we're not allowed to catch but like 8 lizards out of the stream to fish with, but they can destroy a habitat forever. And if anybody visits the Yellowfinch tree sits, view the stream below the LOD. It is rusty. It has rust water clouds in it. It is nasty. It stinks.
Yes, this is something that we've seen a lot the effects of erosion and sedimentation, and those who are documenting have just, I mean, every day there's something new, especially after it rains, which is what I think that Neil is asking for support with tomorrow, given that you can't be everywhere when they're actually, you know, on the property. How long a stretch would that be for you, Neil?
The easement is 525 foot, but we also have a buffer zone, so it's approximately about 800 feet, maybe a little bit more than that right now. But I can only be in one area at a time, and I can only get, you know, I can't be on both sides of the easement. You know, there's only so much that I can do, and I can't be there 24/7.
Right, exactly. So since we have a lawyer on the line, Jonathan, I'm curious about something. You know, one of the things that we've been told for some time, those of us who've been resisting, is that there are a lot of things that they're doing that are technically not breaking a law. They're violating a court order, but they're not breaking a law. And what we've seen over and over again is that the court orders don't really mean anything, because they'll apply for and receive variances before or after the fact. I mean, it's just a wicked game of shuffling paperwork, basically. But if they're not breaking a law, then, you know, is there any sort of immediate recourse for people who are facing this that you've uncovered over, you know, your years of observing and doing legal research on this?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question, and hi to Jamie. Jamie is one of the unsung heroes of this whole fight. He's really been in the trenches, and my hat's off to him for all the great work he's been doing. One thing I've learned over the course of 35 years of practicing law, mostly in the federal courts, is that federal judges really, really don't like it when you violate their court orders. So to your question, Mara, if there's a court order in place with regard to any of these issues, and people think that order has been violated, then the remedy is to get the lawyers in the case that generated that order to have the pipeline company or whoever is violating the order brought up on contempt charges. And my experiences as judges are much more interested in violations of their own court orders than they are necessarily in the merits of the case that resulted in that. So if there's a violation of a court order, people need to be bringing that to the judge's attention.
Okay. Well, bringing it to a judge's attention, I think, is one thing. It does seem as if law enforcement tends to work for them and not for us, in terms of there's no, way to really call the law on them. And if so, is it local? Is it state? Is it federal? This has been clear as mud in a lot of ways. And so, I mean, sometimes there isn't an answer, perhaps, but the thing. Go ahead.
Just to address the broader question. I mean, my heart goes out to Neil, and I it's easy for me to sit here and give my views on what remedies might be when he's out there every day facing this monster. So I really feel for him and his family, and I know it's difficult. My view is that there's sometimes the solution to what I would call the short term, meaning the immediate problem, is hard to come by. The long-term solution here is we all need to stop this pipeline. And once we do stop this pipeline, we need to move to the next step, which is to hold the criminal company that was behind this pipeline responsible, have them dig out the pipe, reclaim the land, remedy whatever pollution has been generated, and restore Neil's property and the hundreds of other properties that have been damaged by their actions. So I think that really ultimately is the solution, is stopping the pipeline and getting it out of the ground and holding the $1 billion company behind
I would
this
love to have you on the show sometime.
responsible.
We're in the middle of it right now.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that.
I'll second that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's everybody on the line here could agree to that at the moment. And it's maybe small comfort at the moment, Neil, but I do hope that you receive some support. And I know that it is your plan to be out there and watching them and hoping that your appeals will bear some fruit in terms of what you were faced with on Friday.
That is my hope as well. I put as much levity into my email as possible. I took several opportunities to quote several sections of our organic requirements, stating that it was a requirement to provide the material beforehand, before use, because if you didn't do so, you could void your organic certification by not doing so. And so within the content of that email, I made it very clear that if they chose to come through my property, they would be assuming all liability and financial risk involved. And that's really all I can do at this point.
Well done. And I appreciate you doing that, and also for leading by example in that from the beginning you have shared all this information with everyone who's involved. Neil, do we still have you on the line? I think we just lost Neil. Okay. Because he was talking, and then I believe it cut him off. So, this is something that I know you've observed, Jamie, in terms of people doing their best to continue to document and, uncover and expose what's been done. What are some of the things that you've witnessed recently in terms of, it seems as if Franklin County and Montgomery County are where they're focused in terms of their construction activities at the moment.
Right. Like I said, there's just a lot of congestion, and there's so many things that's happening around us that we have no control over, and those in Richmond, those that we depend on, our elected officials, we're not seeing it back here in Southwest Virginia. We're seeing devastation. We're seeing cancerous pellets dropped on organic farms and into our waterways. If I throwed a handful of paper with some chemicals on it in our streams, they would write me a ticket. But to them, they've got a free pass.
Yeah, that's what I've heard from a lot of people, especially folks who work in construction. That they're required to adhere to pretty strict requirements that it seems as if the MVP is not.
And something that gets me is a lot of folks sit back and they do not want to get involved. But when it's the air that we all breathe and the water that we all drink, the children that we watch grow up, how can we not get involved? How do we sit around and live with ourselves and just expect somebody else to clean up the world, the environment? I don't understand, but I do understand direct action.
Yes, you do. And you said something earlier that I want to go back to, that you were pretty much his ride. You were Philip's ride yesterday.
Yes.
And I want to take the opportunity to point out to people, I stopped at a coffee shop on my way to Elliston yesterday from Bent Mountain, and I spoke to a woman who was working there, who saw that I had a no MVP painted on my face. And she asked me about it and said, she lived in Elliston and has 2 young kids, 18 months old and 36 months old. And she said, I want to get involved, but I'm scared. And I'm scared for my kids. And we talked a little about that, how she's scared for her kids getting involved in the fight, but she's also scared for her kids living with, you know, a pipeline within the blast zone or even the incineration zone. It sounded as if she was pretty close. And what I told her, and what I want to point out about what Jamie just said, is that Jamie has been support. He has been camp support. He has been, I guess yesterday would be jail support, and that there's a lot of ways in which you can support those who are taking direct action without taking that legal risk yourself. That's, I think, something that's so often misunderstood. There are a lot of roles to play. Jamie is well known, I said, for his resistance garden, and as well as, you know, bringing food and providing rides. And that's something that people can do to support if you're near the construction zone or destruction zone, as we call it. And I think that it's, like I said, it's often misunderstood, you know, and am I correct, Jamie, that that's generally the role you play is support, you know, as well as having been a guide, I believe, at one point.
Yes. I done a little bit of guide service on Peters Mountain in Nutty's campaign with the monopod. Costed the National Forest about $500,000. And now I'm you know, I basically try to show up and smile and bring whatever I find wherever I can find it.
Yes, and thank you for that. I know that Jonathan and Neil are both familiar with you, and most of us are, with bandana and the walking stick. My friend, you're everywhere.
Well, I'm an affected landowner, you know. I'm an innocent bystander. That's what a lot of people don't understand, you know. It's coming through the center of Neil's property, but it's going around my property, but between me and my water source. You know, I'm an innocent bystander. I don't stand to gain or lose. Well, I don't stand to gain. All I stand is to lose from this project. And, you know, I'm a citizen of the state of Virginia. Worked all my life to try to have something, and now without water, you know, you know my story. I've lost my ponds, my cattle. What money I did have, I could have put into my farm. I've put into bread pans and bags of dirt, you know, and packed the seeds. So I'm just like Neil. My resources are exhausted. You know, that's what this pipeline has done to 2 farmers along this project.
Which is why we really need as many people as possible to plug in. You know, the bigger issue here, the bigger picture, so to speak, is a lot of people from all over the planet are paying attention to what's happening to the planet, but that there's always something near you that you can plug into. And in Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina, one of the very major issues that ties into a lot of other climate justice issues, such as compressor stations and fracking and LNG, are these pipelines. And you know, we need as many people as possible who are willing to plug in and support, and because there's a lot to do, and people like Neil and people like Jamie are putting all of themselves into this. So, you know, Jonathan, I know that one effort that's been made by many of us is to link what's going on in Southwest Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina to the Northern Virginia area, given that there's so much political sway there. We've done, you know, we've had an event there in Leesburg, Mark Herring's hometown, bringing Appalachia to Northern Virginia, you know, and I think Stand with Red really brought the attention to the population up there. You know, do you have any other ideas as to how we can make that link? Because I think once you get outside of the area, it's hard for it to seem quite as real.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, Maren. Thank you. We need to bring the fight to Northern Virginia. We need to make people understand up here that this is one Commonwealth. That what happens to people in Southwest Virginia affects us in terms of the rights that are being violated because we're next. It affects us because we all breathe air, we all drink water. It's one planet, and allowing these pipelines to go in, which are going to be the equivalent of 45 coal-fired power plants, is going to erase anything else Virginia contemplates doing to fight global warming and greenhouse gases. So people are affected. Their pocketbooks are affected because in the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, Dominion's going to pass the cost on to ratepayers. So we're going to all pay for the privilege of having our water polluted and our air polluted. So I think people need to really understand that they are directly affected. To Jamie's comments, I think it's important for people to understand the fight against these pipelines is really a war of attrition. There's not going to be a magic bullet that's going to, we're going to wake up one day and they're going to be stopped. The pipeline companies will be telling us that it's inevitable that these pipelines will be complete, and they will be telling us that in press releases and in everything else until 5 minutes before they cancel, because that's the way corporations operate in this country. So these pipelines are both costing, they're billions of dollars over budget, both of them, and they're years behind schedule for both of them. And that's why I say it's a war of attrition. The direct action that's being taken, and I'll be clear for my friends at the Virginia Fusion Center who may be monitoring this and other broadcasts, I'm not advocating anything in particular, but I am a student of history, and the historical fact is that direct action has contributed to the winning of every social justice fight this country has ever had, whether it's the labor movement or the women's movement or the gay rights movement or the civil rights movement. And it won't be any different here. In the case of the Jefferson National Forest, where Jamie was my guide and guide for many others to visit, a young woman who went by the name of Nutty, who was atop what they called a monopod for 57 days. The monopod is basically a telephone pole with a cot on top, and I'm still amazed that she was able to do this. But her lone act of civil disobedience delayed construction on Peters Mountain just long enough for the Fourth Circuit in July of 2018 to come out with an order vacating the permits that would have allowed the continued construction of the Mountain Valley Pipeline across Peters Mountain. So there was a direct link between the direct action that was taken by this young woman and a court order which stopped the construction that she was trying to stop with her body. So people need to understand there's a lot of ways to get involved in the struggle. Not everybody's going to take that kind of direct action, but supporting people who are fighting on the front lines in any way possible and forcing our politicians to speak out is going to cause further delay, further cost to these companies. And as I said, up until 5 minutes before they cancel it, they'll tell us we're wasting our time, and then they'll cancel the projects, and we'll go about the business of rectifying the damage that they have already done.
Exactly, because when we're losing, it's easy to tell, but when we're winning, it's kind of difficult to know. They don't want you to know. We've got to interpret that for ourselves. And I do want to say that yes, it was the lone act of one person who was sleeping up in that monopod, and yet her banner said the fire is catching. And when Becky Crabtree, who is a school teacher from West Virginia on the other side of Peters Mountain, blocked construction by sitting in her 1971 Pinto, the markings on the side of her Pinto said the fire is spreading. And so it is and isn't a lone act. You know, we've had aerial resistance in Southwest Virginia for close to 2 years. I think it's a year and a half now. It'll be 2 years in February. The Yellowfinch blockade will have been up a year in September, and each piece has contributed to the next. And so you being a part of it in whatever way we're able, when in my opinion, we have exhausted legitimate means, is really important. It all is connected, as well as being courageous and individual acts of resistance.
Yes.
So,
well, my attitude is, if you're fighting, you're winning. You just need to keep fighting. And there's an overemphasis in this country on sort of the lone hero, and part of the intention of that, I think it's intentional, is to deny the effect of movement. You know, we all read our history books about Rosa Parks sitting down on a bus and what a heroic woman she was. But that was no accident. She was active in the NAACP. There was a whole movement in Birmingham that preceded her sitting down. The actions were planned by the movement, choreographed by the movement, and that movement eventually succeeded in the Montgomery bus boycott. I may have misspoken on the city before, but I believe it was the Montgomery bus boycott, which ended segregation in public transportation in that city, and it was the movement that did it. But you won't read that in your history books. You'll read that it was one woman who did it. So it's a way of denying the power of movements. This movement is certainly much broader than 1 or 2 or 5 individuals who've done direct action. It's a big movement. They're a part of it. And the fire is growing, it is catching, and that's why I think eventually we're going to win.
Indeed. Well, I've believed that we would win for 5 years now, so why would I stop? Jamie, do you believe that we will win?
I don't get up every day with a desire to be with my friends and to try to make a difference in a world that's gone downhill. So yeah, we will win.
Indeed. And I think, you know, that's the gift within all of this crisis and trauma, are the relationships that we've made and the community that we've built along the way, because I miss you when I don't get to see you for a while. And it's sometimes the situations we find ourselves in are certainly not the situations any of us want to be in, but I'm always glad to see you, Jamie. Neil, do you believe that we will win?
I absolutely believe that we will win, and we are not going away until we do.
Ha Wanga, indeed. Wanga. Because it is all part of the whole. And I'd like to, because we have Neil back on the line, kind of recap a little bit of what we've talked about over the course of the show today.
There's some people I know that only joined us in the last hour.
Right.
Such as Jessica Sims. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Jessica. So we had Richard Avert on the show earlier, and he and Neil spoke to the meeting that they had this last week with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, talking about, you know, specific issues as landowners regarding, you know, the certification and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, as well as other pipelines in Pennsylvania and I believe New Jersey. This was something that's fairly rare, that you get a meeting with a commissioner. And I want to commend Neil for really spreading the work he's done far and wide, and really sharing it with everybody, with the DEQ, with the FERC, with the DEP in West Virginia, and the media and all of this, because I think that's made a big difference. And just in the last little while, we've had a report from on the ground in Southwest Virginia from Jamie Hale, who was there yesterday when the route of the Mountain Valley Pipeline was blocked for around 6 hours by someone who actually spent quite a great deal of time in the tree, and the oak tree at the Yellowfinch blockade in Elliston, Virginia. And due to the fact that construction is proceeding at a pretty rapid rate towards the camp, chose to put his body on the line under a tree and had to be extracted, and was arrested for obstruction, I believe were the official charges, and released, and suffered some health consequences. He was very dehydrated and I think had some heat exhaustion, but he is okay, and stopped construction for some time. And we've also been speaking today with Tammy Belinsky and Jonathan Sokolow, who's still on the line, about some of the legal issues surrounding these things. And, specifically, we spoke some about the FERC and, what could be done, what the potential is here, especially regarding the crossing of the Appalachian Trail, which seems to be one of the many things that is holding the Atlantic Coast Pipeline back from constructing at the moment, but somehow is not preventing construction on the MVP.
Right.
And maybe we could, I think that's a pretty good recap of everything we've talked about.
That's excellent, yeah.
And if maybe, Jonathan, you could take a minute to explain one more time the differences, because I know as a layperson, and despite the fact I have, as I informed Mark Herring in Harrisonburg with Josh Vanna not too long ago, I have many friends who are really excellent lawyers and patient with my questions. There's still a lot of this I don't understand. Why can't the ACP, cross the Parkway, but the MVP can? What is the difference between, there's briefs filed or not filed in regards to the Appalachian Trail that is holding back the ACP, but not the MVP? Can you simplify it at all for those of us who are trying to deal with, cognitive dissonance on a regular basis?
Thank you for the question, Mara. I will try. The court system is beguiling in a lot of ways, and it's particularly frustrating in the case of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, because I said earlier there's a bit of a disconnect. I think we're winning the fight against the Mountain Valley Pipeline, but it doesn't feel that way on the ground, certainly to the people like Neil who are dealing with the disaster that's being imposed upon them. But I do think that there's been some important victories in the courts. With regard to your question, Mara, let me just try and sort of unpack it. Both pipelines are prohibited right now from crossing the Appalachian Trail. That's number one. Number two, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is not engaged in any construction along the route of the pipeline in any of the three states that it crosses, but not because of the Appalachian Trail issue. It's because of an entirely unrelated case that was brought against the Fish and Wildlife Service having to do with endangered species. And when the Fourth Circuit issued an order I believe it was last December, while that case was pending, they issued what's called a stay pending appeal, meaning the incidental take statement that would have allowed the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to construct and destroy some endangered species was stayed, meaning they couldn't rely on it. So because of that, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline has stopped construction along the entire route, and that case is still pending. That I believe was argued before the Fourth Circuit in May, and we're expecting a decision. It could be any time now. So that's why the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was stopped. I don't think the same decisions have been made or litigated, fought in the courts with regard to the Mountain Valley Pipeline, but there are issues with regard to endangered species. As I mentioned a few minutes earlier, just 2 days ago, a letter was sent to the Mountain Valley Pipeline by FERC asking them to account for impact on some endangered species, particularly several bat species, as well as birds, as well as on a different topic, the impact of the greenhouse gas effect impact on of their construction activities. So there are some overlap of issues, but the specific issue with regard to the Appalachian Trail, that's not what stopped the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. However, if the court decision with regard to the Appalachian Pipeline stands, I mean, as it is now, there's a Fourth Circuit order that effectively prohibits either pipeline from crossing the Appalachian Trail. As Richard, I think, was stating quite correctly earlier, that can only be changed by an act of Congress or by the United States Supreme Court. If one of those two things does not occur, then neither pipeline can cross the trail. And if you look at a map, you will find out pretty quickly that you can't get here from there.
Yep.
These pipelines will be done, both of them, if that decision stands. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we continue this fight, that these pipelines are in very serious trouble. Mountain Valley is talking about some sort of scam land swap that they think is going to get around the Fourth Circuit decision. I don't think they're correct. So they're going to keep fighting, but the pipelines are both in serious trouble as a result of that decision, but that's not why the construction stopped. The construction stopped on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline because of another decision having to do with endangered species that did not apply specifically to the Mountain Valley Pipeline.
And is it true that it was voluntary on Dominion's part, that they cease other aspects of construction, or not?
Well, it was voluntary in the sense that they volunteered to do it right before the court was about to order them to do it.
Okay. Fair enough.
So I think if they had not volunteered to stop construction, the court would have ordered it. They wanted to be in control of their own actions, so they figured, I think, that if they were to voluntarily stop, they could reverse course more easily than having to challenge a court order or a FERC order that ordered them to stop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't really matter at this point. The case has been argued. There's going to be a decision either this month or next month, I would expect, by the Fourth Circuit on that issue with regard to the endangered species. And if the Fourth Circuit continues where it is now, and I believe the same three judges heard this challenge as having heard the earlier challenges on the other issues with regard to the pipeline, I think Dominion's going to lose that issue. And if they lose that issue, that may be the point at which they say that they're done with this project.
So do we have any sort of time frame on the decision regarding the Appalachian Trail that could table both projects?
Yes. So, as I said, the status quo right now is neither pipeline has any authority to cross the Appalachian Trail.
Right.
Dominion filed a petition with the Supreme Court on June 24th, I believe, asking the Supreme Court to hear the case. The Trump administration joined Dominion in that effort, which tells you something about who's on which side with regard to these pipeline fights. I've read that decision would be made, expected in October, as to whether the court will hear it. It takes 4 votes by 4 justices of the Supreme Court to vote to hear a case. Most cases are not heard. I think Richard mentioned quite correctly earlier, cases are taken either that have a constitutional impact, or there's a split among the lower courts. Neither of those are the cases here. But I'm not so naive as to believe that the Supreme Court makes decisions based necessarily on those factors. It's quite possible 4 judges would decide to hear the case. It would take 5 to reverse. I think the odds are against Dominion, but we should know by October whether the court will agree to hear the case. And then if they do hear it, decision wouldn't be made till the following spring of 2020.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, that's hence the wheels of justice not turning swiftly of us, for those of us who are trying to, make sure we tend our gardens so we can feed our tree people.
Well, the good news is we're on the winning side of that issue right now.
Yes, it is.
So,
it is good news.
If I'm Dominion, I'm saying we're not going to know till next year whether we can even cross the Appalachian Trail. And if I'm a Dominion investor and the banks that fund these companies, I'm going to be especially nervous that what Tom Farrell is telling me, all this happy talk about everything is fine, might not be correct.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm wondering, Jamie or Neil, given that we've got a lawyer on the line who can explain things in a way that I can understand, which is tricky, the legalese surrounding some of these issues. Are there any questions that either one of you have based on what you're observing, right in front of you, or as affected landowners, that you'd like to ask John while we've got him here?
I think I'd like to circle back to the question I asked right before we broke for a station break, and that's what else can we do to affect the outcome of, politicians' decisions, court decisions? What else can we do? What actions can we take to speed up the process of getting a full stop work order? What are our options? What can we do?
Well, in terms of it's not strictly a legal question, I guess. FERC has the power to issue a stop work order, so appealing to FERC obviously is one option. Virginia has the power, the Department of Environmental Quality, so appealing to them, putting pressure on them to issue a stop work order. Those are the legal avenues. But I think ultimately it's not a legal question. It's a question of power. And I think what we all need to be doing, not just Neil and Richard and people on the front lines, but particularly people in my neck of the woods in Northern Virginia, is we need to keep pressuring our politicians to put pressure on DEQ and to put pressure on FERC to do the right thing here. We need to get this issue on the front burner, getting public attention to it in the newspapers and TV so that people are aware of it. These companies thrive on people being ignorant of the subject. They go along, people go along with their lives thinking, well, we have Democrats in office who believe in, recycling and plastic bags and electric cars, and therefore they're doing great things for the environment, and it happens not to be true. So I think, trying to expose that hypocrisy and putting public pressure on our elected officials to do something in whatever way we can, through rallies, letters to the editor, town hall meetings, contacting your elected officials directly, all of the above is what we need to be doing.
Indeed. And I wanted to point out in regards to that, Jonathan, that Maury Johnson mentioned that there is a deadline for comments to the FERC of July 18th to FERC and the Army courts. So there's some information about that on the thread of the live stream. If anybody wants to, he put a link there to a West Virginia River site. So that's something you can do. That's actually what I pointed out to the woman in the coffee shop yesterday, was that making a comment like she made to me to the media could be as useful as, anything else, and hopefully not dangerous. Saying, I'm worried about my kids. I'm scared for my kids. They're this age. We need as many voices out there in as many ways as possible so that those who don't know learn. Jamie?
Yeah, what I don't think people understand or appreciate is that one action leads to another. So, Mara, you know this. I don't think Red Terry and her daughter Minor had a plan in effect as to how they were going to create public pressure to stop what was going on at Bend Mountain. They just climbed a tree.
Yes, we actually.
And some of us in Northern Virginia heard about it. Some of us had the privilege of going to Bend Mountain to see them. And then we started organizing press conferences and petitions and, getting some attention in Northern Virginia. And we actually got a bunch of elected officials to start wearing, Stand With Red t-shirts. So one action leads to another. It's like a pebble in a lake. So anything people can do is valuable and helpful.
Indeed. And I believe we have Maury Johnson on the line to maybe explain a little further what I just mentioned. Maury, are you there? I can't, hold on. We can't hear you. Hold on. You need to start over. We need to push all the buttons correctly.
Okay.
Hey, Maury, welcome.
Are we ready?
This is Maury Johnson from Monroe County, West Virginia.
Yeah, we're winding down the show. It's been a great show. Been a lot of great information. Thank everybody for what they've said today. But these comments, there's some important deadlines, and you don't have to be a West Virginian to make comments to the West Virginia Rivers over this consent order that they have imposing a fine of $265,792 to be exact for probably millions of dollars of damage to our streams and waters here. So if you want to make that comment, the link I posted a little while ago. But it's kind of like a drunk driver running through your house and then being fined a penny. That's so when you make those comments, please ask West Virginia DEP to multiply those fines by 100%, which they have the right to do. As far as the 404 comments of the Huntington District of the Army Corps of Engineers, it's important that everybody across the country speak up about that. There's information on the West Virginia Rivers Facebook page about that, and I do appreciate everybody's work on this. And as I will agree with everybody, we're winning. They don't want to say it, but we are winning.
We are winning indeed, Maury, and thank you for that additional information. You know, that's something that the more comments they get, the better. And you know, if you write a really good set of comments, consider publishing it as a letter to the editor or something like that as well, so it goes a little further.
Yeah, the comments with DEP is the 18th, the Army Corps of Engineers the 27th. I know that they're soliciting comments from people about the pipe coatings. I actually have pipe on my farm sitting on the ground waiting to be put in a ditch that was coated in early 2017. I had pipe put in the ground in February that was coated in December of 2016, well over the expiration date of this pipe. So the things I've seen are just horrendous.
Yes, I know, Maury. It's been nightmarish, and the things that you've seen.
And Neil's seeing them now. What I saw last summer, Neil is seeing them now.
Neil is seeing them now, and the things that Jamie's seeing is, you know, the center of the blockade part of this resistance. We're going to have to close the show here soon. Jamie, can you give us one more glimpse?
Talk to you later.
Thank you, Maury.
Thanks, Maury.
Can you give us one more glimpse as to what it looks like on the ground in Southwest Virginia, where we've had a active tree sit, the Yellowfinch blockade, for 323 days today?
Well, it looks like folks sitting around in the woods, having some donuts, you know, hanging out, living life, and there is rattlesnakes, there is dangers. There was a dog that was bit recently by what they believe was a rattlesnake. They're not 100%, but you know, you seen on the AAP the page, the big rattler that crossed the road.
I did.
It was dangerous conditions, but mostly what I see on the ground is, you know, smiling faces, friendly folks, people who are concerned about the next generation. And with the next generation, you know, you said something about a mother wanted to get involved, but she was a single mother and she had a child. Well, to all the mothers out there that do not get involved, your children will never grow up in a safe environment, because cancer, poison water, fracked water will cause disease on this earth. And so you're trying to protect your children from nothing.
Well, thank you for those words, Jamie. And
words.
there are many, many ways that mothers and children and dogs and grandpas and, you know, everyone can show up and join together and help. And I encourage each and every one of you to find a way to do so. And one place to go if you're unsure of what to do is on the Water is Life Protected page. There's a weekly gift to us called the 7 Protections, and it has a whole list of places you can show up. You can contact the Appalachians Against Pipelines page if you want to offer any sort of camp support, or if you have donations for those who have been resisting for a very, very long time and are depending upon support. And I would like to thank everyone who's been on the show today. Tammy Belinsky, Richard Averett, Neil LaFerrier, Jonathan Sokolow, Jamie Hale. Thank you all for being here with us. And it takes all of us. We're quite a diverse group just here on the line.
It takes the village to protect the water. This is Jay Tubb. Before we sign off, I want to encourage you folks to support this station. We are supported by our community and by businesses like the Thrifty Quaker here in Midlothian, Virginia, which is a thrift store, and they provide us support. They're located in Midlothian Station Shopping Center at the corner of Midlothian Turnpike and Coalfield Road. The Thrifty Quaker sells donated items to support the work of 12 varying, mostly local charities each year. This month's charities are the Cat Rescue Shelter and Operation Catnip. Together, they're helping homeless cats get neutered and find homes. More information at thethriftyquaker.com.
I just want to give it a shout out to Tina Badger because of the catnip.
Oh,
so, yeah, she's been a guest many times. So, Jamie, if you see Tina, please give her our love because you're closer to her than we are right now.
She has a big cat.
I know. So I hope that she's doing it better. And thank you all for being on the show today.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Richard. And thank you, Jamie. And thank you, Mari, for calling in. And to Tim Gross, for a lawyer in Pennsylvania who is listening to the show, who I'd love to talk with him more. It was not easy to try to talk to him during the show. But this is the July 14th edition of Citizen Voices Radio. We will not have a show next week. I will be in New England visiting my daughter. She turns 20 this month, so no longer a teenager. I'm very happy about that. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Check out the links in our comments that have been posted by us and by other people. Thank you, Kay, for tuning in and helping us with that posting. And 2 weeks, July 28th will be our next show. We're lining up guests for that now. And thank you so much. Support the water protectors. And we now return you to our regularly scheduled Pacifica radio feed.
I will have a glass of the Pandit, please. Oh, sure.